Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about book cover design, very specifically how I designed this book cover, The Wasting Desert. This is a little 99-cent fantasy horror short read, which you can get on Amazon, or $4.99 or your regional equivalent for the paperback. I saw some people on Twitter liked this book cover design, so I thought I'd go over how I made it, both on the technical level in Photoshop, all the stuff that's there in Photoshop to make it look the way it looks, as well as the bigger design principles that guided its construction. So before I get into that, I'm going to start with the design principles. But before I even get into that, I want to basically make it clear that a book cover is really an ad for the story that's within. And so the purpose of a book cover should be to convey to a potential reader the contents of the book and to set up the appropriate expectations for the book that they're going to read. In this case, it's a fantasy horror book, and so there are certain things that go into the overall design of it. There are three big design elements to any book cover. That is the text, the central image, and then the auxiliary elements of the image. In this case, the text is going to be the title text as well as the author text. The central image is this skull with the tusks, and the auxiliary parts of the image would be the desert stretching into the background, as well as this strange moon or planet that's kind of hovering in the sky, and maybe a couple of scattered stars here and there. So those are the elements that go into this. I chose these elements to convey to the reader that it is in the fantasy genre, but it's also a horror story, or maybe it's dark fantasy. So the skull definitely will say horror to most people. If you have these glowing eyes within the skull, that represents some sort of supernatural element, which will hopefully again reinforce the horror and fantasy elements that are there. And then you have these tusks, which will hopefully again reinforce both the horror and fantasy elements within. The moon should clue a little bit into fantasy because it's actually not our moon. And then the title text in this these classic serif fonts should also say that it's really in the fantasy genre area and not so much just in the straight horror area. I would have done a different kind of text design, more like eyes in the walls or something like that, if I were going to do just like straight horror. You might have some really different kind of design elements going into the text. So when we're looking at the text, I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, this does have this bevel effect going on, and then the W and the D are both larger than their surrounding words. This is a kind of an asymmetric principle to text design that makes the text really draw the eye in my experience, as well as the way that we line things up so the W and the D are kind of slightly off kilter from each other. If you just put it as everything's the same size, it tends to just kind of blend in. But if you have some letters stand out, then I think it can draw the eye quite a bit more. And this sort of chiseled effect on the text, I think, also communicates that it's in the fantasy genre, as well as the serif fonts here. So let's go ahead and let's go through and we'll go through the Photoshop elements, and I'll show you everything that I did in Photoshop. To do this, again, starting with the text. So if we start with the author text down here, it's actually very simple what I did here. This is in Cormorant SC. That's the font I used. I think it's a great font for author names because the smaller caps are above the midline, so the X height is high, and I think that looks good for a small cap font. So you see that the smaller caps are pretty tall, but they're not so tall that they overshadow the big caps. Again, it's that principle of asymmetry where some of the letters are really popping out because they're bigger. And then A Tale of the Eternal Dream, that's just in all caps to make it very even, because that's kind of subservient to both The Wasting Desert and the author name. And this little line here in the middle, this is just a rectangle I drew. And I grouped all of these things together and put a drop shadow on them. The drop shadow is not that necessary, but it really enhances the contrast of especially the Eternal Dream part right here. This is pretty much black down here, so we don't need it for the David V. Stewart part, but it does help the Eternal Dream stuff kind of stand off this background. So let's go ahead and hide that. Next one is the title text right here. Again, this is in its own group, and we can make that disappear, and you can see more of the image behind it if you want. And really, this one, I more or less already explained it. It has a bevel and emboss effect. If I turn that off, this is what it looks like without the bevel and emboss. It's just brown. It has a very thin stroke in gold. If we turn that off, that's what it looks like. This font, by the way, is Trajan Pro 3, which I use for lots of titles. I think it's a great serif font to use in fantasy, or really, I mean, it can do duty in a variety of genres depending on how you design the actual text. There's a slight inner glow, which tends to go with the bevel and emboss to give it this kind of brown look. So I gave it like a brown inner glow. And then the color overlay is more or less gray. There is a very slight gradient overlay of a gold. And then there is a drop shadow. So if we take all of that off, the main thing that I started with was just designing it in white like that, the Wasting Desert. And then I added all of these effects onto it to get it to pop out and look the way that I wanted it to look. In the actual printed form, it doesn't have like 3D text. That would be something that I think would be cool if you were doing a more traditionally published book, to make that text pop off and really have a three-dimensional effect when somebody were to pick it up. So let's hide that. Now, the next thing I want to show is that when I'm actually designing the photo composite of a cover, what I tend to do is I actually will design it with a filter like this on. This is a hue saturation filter. I set it kind of to a color that I was thinking I might want to design the overall book cover in. I didn't mention this before, but you actually want fewer colors in most book cover designs, not more. So this one's really an orange cover. It just needs to be orange and yellow. That's the covers those are the colors that are really going to communicate the desert and just more of the horror genre as well. Red tends to be associated a lot with horror. So I just picked this thing. I turn down the saturation here, and of course, you could play with it, but I like to turn down the saturation so it's almost black and white. And I turn on colorize, and which is a little thing right here, and then I can set the hue to whatever I want it to be. In this case, I just set it to red. This makes it a lot easier to blend all of the elements together and see what they're going to look like without having to worry about matching all the color grading for every little piece of photo thing that you're using. And then when you're ready to kind of finalize the design, you take that off, and then you can work with each individual element to get the color like really perfect. In this case, as I was working with it, I decided I really liked the orange better than just like a straight red. There's nothing wrong with the straight red, but in a digital space, especially if you were to see this on Amazon, it really tends to pop out, I think, with this brighter, higher contrast approach. So the next thing here is a selective color on the skull. So I have this big group called the skull, which it has several elements to it. So the selective color is there just to kind of pull it into an orange space. If we take it off, that's what it looks like without the color. We really do want to have those colors blend together so everything looks like it's existing in some sort of hellscape. That's really what I like to go with here. But let's talk about the elements of the skull. So the first element here I'm going to hide is these eye flares. What these are just lens flares. So I made a layer. In fact, we can take this layer off. Actually, this layer is above the eye flares. This is a smoke layer. And all I did for the smoke layer was I drew a bunch of squiggles in white with like my paint, my brush tool. And then I ran a liquify filter, and I faded liquify to about 50, 60%. And I did that 3 or 4 times, and then you get this effect of kind of fog or smoke that works there, okay? So that's what I did to get this smoke effect, which looks like there's kind of smoke kind of bleeding out of the eyes a little bit and kind of coming off the top of the skull in some places. And I did actually put a drop shadow on the smoke to just hide it a little bit and blend it in a little bit more. So we'll take the smoke off. Next are the eye flares, which are just these 2 eye elements here. They're 2 lens flares on 2 different layers. You fill the layer with black, you render a lens flare, and then you set it to screen. You can also use color dodge depending on how you're using it. If you're wanting to like make a bright hot spot on something, you can use color dodge. But otherwise, I just use the screen effect, and then you have the lens flares there. And if you wanted to, you could turn the opacity down on them if you feel like it's too much. You can make them like a little bit softer glow here. I use these to do glowing eyes on a number of horror book covers, and it works pretty well. Next element here is the skull. So I do have this this layer effect here to blend the skull a little bit. On top of the skull, I have some shadows that I painted. I linked this layer to the layer below it, which is the actual skull, so that I didn't have to worry about masking this layer or painting over it. So once I remove these elements, this is more or less what the skull originally looked like. It's a stock photo of a skull. I could have maybe shot one of my plastic skulls somewhere, but this stock photo looked really good. So I pulled it off a black background and just stuck it on here. And then I added some more shadows below it to kind of bring up the contrast up here. And then I added these levels to just brighten the whole thing up and make it match the part that's below it. But anyway, we'll go ahead and turn off the skull. And now we have another element that's below the skull. What is this element? Well, there's a shadow layer here that is again, it's not tied to this layer, it's just there. But if I take that off, we start to see the actual colors of this come out because I've kind of bleached the colors out of it. We end up with this little element right here. What is this? These are actually several layers. One is a layer that I used to kind of fill in because the tusks were not quite as bright as I wanted to right here. There was a little bit of a shadow that I wanted to get rid of. So I just used the clone tool to kind of put that in. And it's a little messy, but no one's probably going to notice it all that much. But yeah, what this is, it's a photograph of a boar skull. And it's in fact a photograph of this boar skull right here, which I just took a picture of it with my phone and dropped it on in there. And what I wanted was those little tusks to kind of pop out from a human skull kind of head on. You could do it from the side, or I could have done something, I guess, with a boar skull to make it look like it's a quill boar or an orc or something like that. But yeah, it's just this boar skull. I just took a picture of it. This is a boar that either me or my dad shot many years ago, and my dad had it turned into this skull from my mom, who's a science teacher, and I think she had it in her room. I have another one like mounted up there too. So yeah, I just wanted these tusks from a boar skull, and I put them below there and blended it together. It really wasn't too hard. All I had to do was kind of cut out what I wanted to, and then I can edit the mask layer on it right here and just kind of erase what parts that I want to erase. So let's get rid of that, and we go a little bit lower, and we have another levels effect here that is just darkening everything that's below it. So we can take that off for now to better see what we're doing. I have another hue and saturation layer, which is to, again, blend all of the colors into one. In this case, it's yellow because it ends up being pulled into the orange space in a higher layer. I do have a shadow layer right here that goes below the skull. So we can take that off. And then I have another smoke layer that goes below the skull. We can take that off. And finally, we're getting to the background of what's going on here. So we've pulled away the central object of this smoking glow-eyed skull. We're now on the lowest layers here. So this is just a stock photo of a cracked desert. We can pull off the hue and saturation layers, I guess, as we go here to kind of see what's there. It's just like a cracked pan desert with mountains in the background and clouds. And all I did for this, I don't even think I had to do anything. I just kind of blended out the bottom and the top with a mask layer. I just kind of painted it off using, if you select the mask, you can just paint with black, and you can just subtly erase parts of the image if you want. You can kind of see the edge of the image up there. And so I can actually delete more of it as we go. And I'm not going to worry about that. So yeah, that's what I did to make this kind of pop out more. And you can even turn down the opacity, and like if I want to bring out the stars here, I could. And you can blend it however you want to blend it if you do something like this. Keep going lower. There's a field of stars. I made this, it's way down here. And then there's the planet right here with that's originally blue, actually. So here's the planet. This is just a stock photo of a planet. I've used it on several covers, including the cover for City of Silver. It's right here in the sea. So I've used this exact one several times as sort of the moon in my fantasy world. Take that off. Now we're at a star layer. I have a brush that's set up specifically to do stars. There's a YouTube tutorial that I pulled this from. I don't know where to find it right now, but you can look up star brush and it'll tell you exactly what to do here. I'll just show you how it works because I'll select this layer and you can just put some stars on, and that's all you have to do. Pretty easy to do, or do it with white. See? Stars. There you go. So there's the star background. I didn't want so many stars that it'd become overpowering, and then it's all on a black background. So stars, planet, color the planet, desert, color the desert, shadows or smoke, shadows over the smoke, some more hue and saturation, another level adjustment, which kind of pulls it into the orange space. That's just a white layer so I can check my, my transparencies. The skull and the boar skull kind of melded together, as well as the a couple of glowing eyes. This was just for, this isn't in the final version, it's just so that I knew where the eyes would be. I could put them back in there if I wanted to. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but I like them, I think, a little bit better without. Some smoke here. Then we have another hue layer that I just used for designing and is not in the final version. We have the title text and we have the author text, and that's the design for the entire thing. So thanks so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is a 99-cent book. There's everything you need to know about the design elements that went into making this on a technical level, and I guess from a more abstract level or principle level. So thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you all next time.